thank you very much for the invitation, which forced me to sort of like think through something of what I'm currently working on. So this is sort of a summary of a project that I've been working on, which is on rethinking how difference and alterity, which are problems that we face today as quite urgent in many ways, if on different levels, how they already emerge much earlier than the usual narrative of the history of philosophy has it. So that's what I'm trying to look at, not just with the historical interest, but the idea is to look at how maybe these earlier iterations of thinking about otherness may actually also two things may help us rethink the history of philosophy and where we stand in it today, but also maybe help us rethink or the way we ourselves deal with those issues and look at how there's a history to it. So I'm very glad to be able to do that with you. I'm going to talk about Montaigne and Spinoza, which are usually otherwise very different. There's rarely that they're dealt with in the same sentence, even that they're looked at. And they are also really very different. Montaigne is the essayist who opposes any attempt at system building, who is a Renaissance man. Technically, periodically, he is in the late exponent of the Renaissance, who breaks free from any form of system thinking, who writes those essays, which are those apparently disconnected, but maybe in some way actually interlinking approaches to think stuff, which are not treatises, they're not books in the traditional ways. So that's the one person, and then Spinoza on the other hand, who famously is perceived as a system builder, who builds an ontology or a metaphysics that is often seen as self-enclosed. So in some way they couldn't be more different from each other. But both, like I think if one looks closer at them, show us a real concern, and I think they're both actually some of the earliest in early modern philosophy who think about difference and make it actually, and that's what I think interesting, a philosophical subject, and a subject that is usually sort of excluded. Like we are trained to think that contradiction, otherness, difference, they don't belong into philosophy. Like we have to first clean up, toss them out, and then we have sort of a nice ground foundation on which to build. And what they try to do is constantly muddy the waters, bring them back in, think about it, and make that actually a central issue of philosophy. So they both, in that way, I think, work very much in very affiliated or in proximity. So while they might appear as temperamentally complete opposites, they share an interest to understand difference and alterity as crucially important aspects, which they make both central to the way they advance their thinking, actually. Seen this way, they become unlikely allies in the project to make difference and alterity subjects that, as I mentioned already, become central to philosophy. And that's not a reading you get usually. That's sort of maybe seems now like made up, like that's what I'm trying to do. So we first, what I first want to do is we look just with you at Montaigne, and then separately at Spinoza. As different as their approaches might be, we will see that they share and they come from very different aspects, approaches, that they share a sustained commitment to developing approaches that highlight the critical role of difference. in the very way we actually think. So the first part I would call thinking with Montaigne. So Montaigne is the person who invented the literary genre, as you may be knowing, of the essay, the so-called essay, or more precisely, actually, he didn't invent the essay, but he gave it his book the title Essays as a complete title of the entire book, and the title stuck, characterizing everything a self-respecting philosophical work, and that wasn't supposed to be, which is chatty, searching, associative, metaphorical, and inconclusive. So that's what these essays are. Removed from any institutional context like church, priest, seminars, seminary, school, or university, Montaigne is also an outsider who wrote his works after his retirement as a member from the royal court and his term as mayor's his term as mayor, or during that time when he was privately occupying himself with just like essay writing as a private affair. So on his estate, which is also called Montaigne, he built himself in the castle called Montaigne, in a private tower, a library to which he withdrew just to read. And on a central beam in that library, he famously carved a line that sums up his skeptical stance. That's in French, que sais-je. That line became very famous as the skeptical line, and I give you just a translation in a minute. The line might be familiar to many of you who read Junie B. I don't know who of you is familiar with Junie B. I hope somebody is. So she would say all the time in her kids' in the kids' books as the character, she's what you know. That's what he means. Que sais-je means what you know, meaning like exactly like we don't know anything. It's the same sort of skepticism that, but with Montaigne, it is today associated with a genuine philosophical attitude. With Montaigne, the idea became popular that philosophy might, after all, be more the asking of questions instead of having all or at least some of the answers. And that's, people often forget that. I always try to remind my students that philosophers are not the ones who know the answers. What we do is, which is hard enough, to ask the right questions. And that's basically, Montaigne is one of those who's pushing that. Now, the essays consist of a bunch of chapters, and they're not called essays. For a strange reason, Montaigne, or he just calls them chapters, or what today we would call, and we are the ones who call them today essays. So he never thought about inventing a genre or something. He just called this attempts. That was the title of the book. And in that way, it became legendary for that. From the first to the last edition now of these essays, Montaigne, the essays grew from there was just one volume, to 3 stately, huge volumes. As he kept adding new chapters, so-called chapters, he continually revised them, edited them, added to them. So this editorial practice is indicative for the writing and thought process that informs Montaigne's project. So he keeps writing, adding, editing, and that's what tells you what is an essay in that way. He was never satisfied. So now, while the essays are as the less, and they grew eventually to like 1,000 pages or so, like that's huge, okay? While the essays are as the less than a page, while the essays are as the less than a page short preface underlines, they are all about just one single subject, as he says in this very short, brief preface, that is the author and his self. It's just, he says, that's all I do. It's like just, and this is really not for anybody. He says, that's really for my friends and family in case they really want to know more about myself than they care. So the author and his self is the very emphasis on this, on the self that opens the book to the remarkable move to make the other its decisive counterpart. So in that way, it's strange. So you think that, okay, now we're going to hear the rest of this book just about this dude. For Montaigne, it turns out, self and other are irreducibly interconnected. This insight runs like a red thread through the 3 long volumes of the essays in avenue turns and figurations or consolations. It finds its most striking manifestations, and so that's a very peculiar feature of this project, in Montaigne's plan to insert a text by his best friend Etienne de la Boétie exactly in the middle of his first edition of the essays. So while he says, okay, I'm just talking about myself here, what he does is really, he says all of a sudden, oh, in the middle of this book, there's going to be this one text by my best friend. This idea is accompanied by a detailed discussion in which Montaigne highlights how the entire rest of the essays is only to serve as an ornamental framework for the book's heart piece, which is these essays. Montaigne's discussion centers around the question of how to remember and represent an other who is no longer alive and with us, and thus absent, an other who is not me, but without whom I would not be who I am, because I'm ever indebted to that person to being who I am. And I don't say much more about this text, but this text also happened to be like probably the most first anarchist manifesto, which is very political. And at its heart piece, again, is like the support of the other, like how we are really nobody without the others, and how we are here because we are so different. And so because we are so different, we help each other. And that's the whole design of nature. And that's sort of the book in the book. But now it gets more complicated. The search for the self becomes then for Montaigne anything but a self-absorbed obsession about an I or a je or an ego, or in French, a moi. Instead, it becomes the gateway to comprehending the constitutive significance of the other, the significance of the relational dynamics between humans through which we become who we are. At the center of this stands the insight of the fundamental role of reciprocity that makes a person only in and through the relationship with others. Montaigne argues now this point's central philosophical significance, not just discursively, that is, by advancing arguments to this effect, but more interestingly, also performatively through the mode of his writing and the textual arrangements. I mentioned already Montaigne's initial plan to put his friend's text as the center of his book, as it were, as the heart piece and axis around which the essays turn. With this move, Montaigne accentuates the complex and involved process of seeking to concede space to another in our thinking, giving space to another person. Montaigne highlights that ultimately we must always end up with a lacuna, a silence, an absence. Making another person present, bring them to life, can, according to Montaigne, only occur indirectly through forms of substitutions, that is, forms that stand in for what is not there. You can't put the person in there, you can only put sort of representations, references of the person. And all these references and representations say is, I'm standing in here for that other thing, that other person that I mean. Okay, and so how do you do that in a sophisticated way without sort of glossing over the difference of that other person or that individuality? Now, what Montaigne demonstrates with the case of the trouble of presenting his friend is ultimately true for any form of discursive presentation. To bring the point home, Montaigne stages the act of further substitutions. For as you know, when you read the essays, he never inserted, actually, he never got to that part to actually insert La Boisse's text and he did not do so for good political reasons that would actually have gotten him in severe trouble and life's harm. For Boisse's text is declared a dangerous and illegal text just a day or two before Montaigne was about to send his manuscript off to the printer. So out does the manuscript go. However, forgetting about this idea and no longer mentioning his friend, Montaigne makes this very point, this act, the occasion to substitute the substitute, putting in its place some innocuous selection of La Boisse's poetry. So he kicks out the revolutionary essay, he puts in these love sonnets. And in the last edition, as he keeps editing, the last edition that Montaigne prepares, however, even these poems are gone and instead replaced by a reference to the poems. So the poems are now referenced only, which replace themselves the text that was initially meant to be placed at the center of the book. So you get what the French call a mise en abîme. You get sort of like a replacement of a replacement. So Montaigne makes this an elaborate study in performing an act of disappearance, whose very disappearance ultimately produces a powerful act of appearance, of an appearance of what is absent. And this model of writing highlights how discourse and writing more generally operate. That is, always by way of substitution. That is, how they are based on a continuous play of difference with irreducible otherness at its heart. This model of presentation now mirrors the way Montaigne approaches the relationship between the I and the other. So it's actually already part of the argument of what he's trying to suggest. So, or demonstrate, literally demonstrate if you want. So while the preface declares the essays to be an extended portrait of the other with warts and all, the reader finds that this portrait turns out to be an unfinished, complex, dynamic, and undifferentiated process of mirror reflections of relations with others. The result is indeed a portrait of the other through all the others, but one that is intimately linked to the context of the rich weave of human social relationships in which the individuality of the other is formed. Portraying an individual, then, Montaigne suggests, consists in an involved process of tracking interhuman relations from which individuals emerge as products of social relations. This has, of course, also political implications, but also non-trivial epistemological consequences. Unlike Descartes, a few decades later, Montaigne rejects the idea of a stable core identity of the ego the way it will become the bedrock of modern philosophy following Descartes. For Montaigne, instead, the self is an after effect, an unstable, volatile, dynamic process that, rather than a fundament on which to build. With Montaigne, we are able to think of the self as a fluid work in progress. Rather than a sovereign egocentric formation, the self comes here into focus in Montaigne as a relationally defined dynamics. This has tremendous epistemological, social, and political consequences. The gist of this kind of approach is that with Montaigne, difference, that is non-identity, is a productive, nurturing, life-affirming principle that as a result changes the way we understand thinking, as well as the organization of social and political life and ourselves as individuals. So that's sort of like just trying to summarize the way what's happening in Montaigne. And now I try to be equally short with Spinoza. And then we can see how they maybe complement each other in some, or have some kind of a synergy. So in Spinoza, we encounter a very different mode of thinking, but one that ultimately affirms difference and alterity as deep principles that define our existence all the way down. Spinoza grounds his approach in a notion of immanence, that is, there is no bipartition of what exists into different kinds of existence. All that exists for Spinoza exists in one cause, nature or God. But it is precisely this rejection of the distinction between immanence and transcendence, or the earthly human and the divine, that ultimately allows for a more open understanding of difference and alterity. So he goes the opposite way, so to speak. He starts with the idea of one self-enclosed framework, and that makes it for him possible to now think difference. Ultimately, in Spinoza, difference comes into focus as, again, a relational determination, always contingent on the relationship between two things. Difference does not exist in and of itself, but only through relationality through which it arises. While in other philosophical approaches, difference appears naturalized and comes with a normative implication due to a bipartition of what exists into facts and norms, immanence and transcendence, what is and what ought to be, for instance, matter and spirit. These distinctions posit their difference in an objective given scheme that refuses further scrutiny. We always sort of operate with them unthinkingly already. And so Spinoza tries to move away from that. As a consequence, the foundational relationality from which these distinctions arise, that I just mentioned, is no longer perceived as relational, but imagined as absolute, or reified, if you want, or naturalized. As a result, these distinctions are naturalized in hierarchical fashion in top-down, first-after sequence. The fact that they are a function of their relational independence is no longer seen. That is, they appear as naturalized, a priori fixed inventory of our intellectual toolbox. And so we are sort of caught traditionally through the parameters of what that toolbox sets out. Now, my point is that with Spinoza, what in Spinoza seems like an odd emphasis on immanence instead of transcendence challenges and undoes the traditional setup that undergirds metaphysical thinking in the first place, ostensibly subverting the way we look at things. Spinoza's approach turns out, upon closer examination, to be more than just a mere reversal of that setup, more like a revolution actually turning around. A genuine turning around, then, immanence in his approach results in more than just an inversion. For with immanence, the way Spinoza thinks it, transcendence is no longer an operative category. It's sort of removed. And immanence, we could say, is just our term we use to account for this phenomenon. It is telling that Spinoza himself, however, does never use the term immanence, a term that is still moored, if you look at it carefully, to a distinction that requires its opposite transcendence as notional opposite. And he tries to precisely move away from this binary thinking. So if we follow Spinoza and consider all that exists as truly interconnected, and so as one, a notion of difference comes into play that is very different from that of a dualist model, where difference must always be viewed as deficient and in some way inadequate. The difference is merely a relational conceived for him. There's no longer like the idea that difference means the privative, negative, deficient, but what it means, it's like the expression of a relation. There's always a difference to something else. Now, the way Spinoza does this is by proposing a metaphysical model in which there is one and only one substance. This substance, which he calls nature or God, or substance, like they're interchanging, is the infinite in which all that exists is to be found for him. At first glance, this scheme must appear as severely problematic, and he was also ridiculed for that. And indeed, Spinoza got his share of critics and detractors who construed his view, reducing everything to being simply part of an undifferentiated lump of being, and being so indistinguishably. But this is not what Spinoza suggests when you look at it. Instead, he goes on to say that everything that exists does so as a mode of the one substance, nature, or God. And these modes, in turn, are only accessible to us through two of the attributes of this one substance. And they are thought and extension. So we never can imagine or think the whole of the substance as one. We only can see it as in terms of modes, and these modes are refracted only through thought or extension for us. And again, we can't both think both at the same time. We can only think it in terms of thought or in terms of extension. And it is through, it is through this dual aspect phenomenon, we could say, which has always two aspects, and we only can see one at the time. It's only through this dual aspect phenomenon of all that exists that everything becomes observable as a function of difference. Because of the crucial function of the modes through which all we think and observe becomes accessible, difference is already baked into the way we see everything that exists, but in a manner that recognizes relationality of everything as the condition in which everything exists. In other words, it is the all-including framework of this metaphysical thinking that makes difference the necessary mode in which all exists. This is the macrostructure. On the ground level, Spinoza offers a discussion spanning from bodies inanimate and animate to the life of the mind manifesting itself in affects, that is, emotions and feelings. Both bodies and minds differentiate into ever more complex forms of individuation, and they do so in constant relations and combination with other bodies and minds. What transpires in Spinoza's thought is an ever more complex network of differentiation that at the same time is a function of the one and unique substance. This is a model that accounts for difference in a non-normative and non-binary way, a model that theorizes difference and alterity as baked into the way things work, yet do so free of any form of prioritizing or privileging one life form over another. Consequently, difference and alterity appear as intrinsic to the modes, that is, intrinsic to the forms of existence as far as we can recognize them. Not unlike Montaigne's approach, Spinoza leads to a socio-political thinking in cooperative forms of what we today would call democratic forms of association. This is because both do away with traditional forms of sovereignty as the ultimate form of legitimation, because both of the kinds of ways I represented to you, thinking of the sovereign has no longer space. There's no room. They're out. There's no room in their thought for such a sovereign that is a self-identical construct of a one. In Montaigne, it doesn't exist because there's nothing that would allow to think that such a thing in theoretical terms. While Montaigne submits to authority where it is in power, he says, well, if it's there, like you adjust in a way, and as long as it is in charge, this is a purely pragmatic choice. It's not one that's intrinsic. In Spinoza, the only thing that could come near to such a thing, like a sovereign, is substance, nature, or God. But the only way we can recognize them or make them operational is through the modes in which they manifest themselves. This means, in other words, even if there were such a thing like a sovereign to be found there, found, there's no way how to make it operational here on Earth in politically sound terms. It just vanishes. So you could say that both Montaigne and Spinoza challenge sovereignty and its lack of deviance, from it, in other words, difference from opposite corners, but the outcome is pretty much the same. And so I have one last section to bring them together, which is called self and other, which happens in both then. Both philosophers also reflect that the self is self in its opaque, unstable, and dynamic volatility is not just a work in progress, but as such always also an other with regard to ourselves. As a result, we can understand better how the other we think, imagine, and construct is always profoundly other from what we hold them to be, and especially with regard to their self-relationship. So in a way, ourselves are also others to ourselves in their view. This means there's nobody and no positionality that can give us an objective picture, because self and other are simply shorthand for particular relational forms rather than self-identical structures stable in and of themselves. As a result, we cannot rely on the self as measure or standard for the other except in relational ways, but never in absolute terms that would establish a universally applicable normativity. The reason is that self and other are relationally determined, that is reciprocally defined in a dynamics that doesn't assign any particular agent a privileged standpoint or authority. They do it with each other, through each other. Nor can a norm, a stable universal norm, be derived from their relationship, because this is intrinsically dynamic and continually renegotiated. The consensus on which this model thrives does not permit universalizable norms. All it allows for are specific relation, and this means context-dependent local norms applicable only to the particular relationships in question. So there can only be specific norms now. There cannot be one about humans in general or about mankind. While this truth is certainly universalizable, that we don't have these norms in itself, it is precisely the provision that prevents any overreaching form of normative rulemaking. It thus does away with tendering tolerance as the model to deal with difference and otherness. As Goethe, the German writer and critic in the 18th, 19th century, but he did that in the 19th century, already observed, tolerance is ultimately just a form of arrogance that legitimizes one's viewpoint by accepting others without what one considers their errors. In other words, a qualified form of recognizing the other only partially while continuing to uphold one's own criteria of truth to be universally valid. And that's what I'm concerned, that a lot of the other talk is just this tolerance, this sort of politically correct embrace without actually giving the others real significance and meaning. However, that is precisely the issue, to limit one's own claims to truth to one's own reach rather than impose one's own views on others. The position of tolerance is ultimately an Augustinian position vis-a-vis people with other beliefs that allows us to embrace others while rejecting their wrong-headed beliefs. Yet such a stance continues to exclude difference and alterity, allowing only reconciliation through assimilation or compartmentalization. That is, it is made in the name of charity. That doesn't make it any better, but just adds the stamp of patronizing to this form of approach. And that's what Goethe had in mind. Now, with Montaigne and Spinoza, it becomes possible to address this problem as going to the heart of the project of philosophy itself. Rather than arguing the case of the other in exclusive moral or ethical terms, They show how the very language we use, the very notions on which we rely, and the very logic require us, once examined more closely, to grasp the constitutive role of difference and alterity as what doesn't impede thought and action, but makes thought and action possible in the first place. Put differently, and I'm almost done, they point the way no longer follow an unexamined form of identitarian politics, ethics, prescribing tolerance at its best as an ethics of exception, but instead to a wholly different approach in which ethics becomes a function of the way we attend to differences to allow the other to be themselves, or the others to be themselves. Rethinking ethics this way, so not put ethics first, but put difference first, and the thinking about it, rethinking ethics this way through rethinking difference cuts deeper than ethical discourse, because it directs us to revisit the foundation of ethics and reimagine issues like agency, responsibility, and action in a fresh way. To conclude now, at the beginning of the 20th century, Rosa Luxemburg said freedom is the freedom of those who think differently. It's a beautiful definition. The thrust of this idea is what informs the path, I would argue, of an alternative philosophy Montaigne and Spinoza seek to articulate. Luxemburg's statement, taken seriously, captures some of this profoundly critical and ultimately emancipatory impulse to which Montaigne and Spinoza give early and pioneering expression. Thank you.